Among the different sections of the anti-left political factions, you find a lot of characters. You've got principled religious conservatives, some libertarians affiliated with the Mises Institute, nationalists, along with smaller, even more marginalized groups of monarchists, neo-fascists, neo-Confederates, and so on. As stated in an earlier video, the right is defined by its acceptance of inequality and recognition of hierarchy, without there being a whole lot of else for common ground. As a result, there's a tremendous amount of disagreement among the various factions and not a whole lot uniting them aside from their opposition to the constant march of progressivism. One of the dividing lines between these various factions is the notion of individualism versus collectivism. Libertarians, or classical liberals, and modern American-style conservatives are perhaps the two biggest anti-left factions in the United States, and they tend to fall on the individualist side of the fence, with older paleoconservatives and everybody else forming the more communitarian angle. A good example of this tension or disagreement is an online debate between representatives of the Free Market Foundation and South African Institute of Race Relations, or IRR, taking the more liberal individualist angle. On the other side of the debate were two members of AfriForum, a large, primarily Afrikaans and minority civil rights group in South Africa, taking the communitarian line. I say communitarian because, as a general rule, even the more radical parts of the right wing tend to think on a community level as a proper way of arranging human living. Sometimes you might encounter more nationalist strains of thinking among European rightist factions, but this isn't really the case within the American context. In contrast, the Western left tends to be both obsessed with individual expression while at the same time constantly associating and grouping people within class structures historically, or nowadays labeling people based on their real or imagined privilege and victim status. Their analysis and understanding of society is fundamentally group-oriented, but in a way that is neither nationalist nor communitarian. An urban, college-educated, white progressive male with Yankee heritage, living in Los Angeles, and burdened by the chains of his white guilt, is a very different person than a rural South Carolinian tobacco farmer with Scotch-Irish heritage who only graduated high school. To the modern intersectional mind of the left, however, these two characters could probably be safely lumped together as white males. Thus, they are somehow both reifying structures of oppression unless they are consciously aligned with people of color and the LGBTQ plus community to dismantle their society from the top down, or something like that. What is the truth, though? Ideology aside, what does the real world tell us about how people truly are? As with a lot of dichotomies, the plain individual versus collective choice, I believe, is a false one. Genetics aside, people are clearly products of where they grew up, how they grew up, the wider culture, neighborhood particularities, language, education, peer groups, and so on. Because of this, the vast majority of people take on the wider culture and values of their surroundings to a large extent. I was personally raised in a small town in Alaska and inevitably took on certain characteristics of that place. An appreciation and preference for natural beauty and smaller communities as opposed to larger towns and cities. A default high-trust disposition and love of liberty. A fanatical devotion to the Second Amendment. A love of the outdoors. A persistent aversion to heat and taxes and desire to be left alone from all manner of busybodies. Then I moved to South Africa. And as you can probably imagine, I didn't turn into a whole new person when I did. With the exception of my high-trust disposition, virtually nothing else changed as a result of my move in terms of my overall temperament. The dirt of South Africa didn't magically make me a South African when I stepped off the plane. That isn't to say I haven't learned a lot by moving here or changed my outlook on a few things, but I remain largely unchanged as I am and will likely remain so for the rest of my life. And yet, despite my upbringing, I've adopted some fairly unorthodox opinions and beliefs which put me at odds with the majority of society, both where I'm from and where I now find myself. The truth is that both individualism and collectivism are true, although more for some than others. As unpopular as it is to say in classical liberal circles, most people seem largely to be NPCs, will remain NPCs and do as they're told by the wider society. They're either incapable or incredibly uninterested in learning about ideas or the world at large, which is perfectly normal, by the way. And yet even they will be a synthesis of individual character, differing from their peers to some degree, while embodying the general character and spirit of the group. To borrow from religious iconography, if we look at the Holy Trinity, we see what I think is the natural synthesis of individual and collective played out symbolically. The Godhead is divided into three parts: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. All three aspects have some distinctions, and yet they comprise one cohesive whole, and the being of God would be incomplete were he missing one of these aspects. To be the divine person is to be in communion or community, and so it is with us mere mortals as well. We're not truly human in isolation, and as the Logos spirates from God the Father, so too are we generated from families, from communities, and with identities uniquely identifiable, but at the same time bearing indelible marks of where we came from. Fundamentally, I think this is the key point the guys at Afroforum were trying to make in their debate. Yes, individuals can have quirks and special characteristics unto themselves. There are also exceptional people who strike out on their own or are social outliers who totally change who they are. Yet this is by no means the rule for society, and were it so, the world would be chaotic. Ultimately, no man is ever his own creator and is neither truly himself nor durable on his own, and this is a virtue of communalism. Well, that's all, folks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, share, subscribe, hit the alert button, and I will talk to you soon.